of this fight, provided by people like Jake Paul, are true, that Logan Paul is making money on the back end of the pay-per-view and Dylan Dennis isn't, and all this scumbag behavior is actually overwhelmingly benefiting Logan Paul and his fiance, if we're talking about people getting fucked, Dylan Dennis is the first name that comes to mind, especially if part of his flat fee payout has to go with settling with Nina Agdal. And then, Danny Masterson was just sentenced to 30 years to life in prison for raping 2 women in 2003. And this has been an absolutely huge case because not only was Masterson convicted of raping 2 women, he was also accused of using his status in the Church of Scientology to silence those women to prevent them from reporting the crime. And these crimes notably happened at the height of his fame on that 70s show, with the jury finding him guilty on 2 counts, though they weren't able to reach a verdict on a claim from a 3rd woman. And upon sentencing him, the Associated Press reported that the judge said, "Mr. Masterson, I know that you're sitting here steadfast in your claims of innocence, and thus no doubt feeling victimized by a justice system that has failed you. But Mr. Masterson, you are not the victim here. Your actions 20 years ago took away another person's voice and choice. One way or another, you will have to come to terms with your prior actions and their consequences." And the AP also reporting this is the maximum sentence, meaning Masterson will only be eligible for parole after serving 25.5 years. And you also had the victims speaking here, with one saying, "You are pathetic, disturbed, and completely violent. The world is better off with you in prison." And the other is saying that he belongs behind bars for the safety of all the women he came in contact with, and adding, "I am so sorry and I'm so upset. I wish I'd reported him sooner to the police." And then Ruby Franke has officially been charged with 6 felony counts of child abuse. Right? We talked about Ruby last week. You might know her from 8 Passengers, a former family YouTube channel. But there's learning that she and her business partner Jody Hildebrandt were arrested after a child, now identified as Ruby's 12-year-old son, climbed out of a window to get help from a neighbor, with him asking for food and water, reportedly having duct tape on his wrists and ankles, appearing malnourished. With another child, now identified as Ruby's 10-year-old daughter, later discovered in a similar condition. And on top of Ruby's charges, Jody was also charged with the same 6 felony child abuse counts, with a county attorney telling NBC News that each count carries a prison sentence of up to 15 years and a fine as high as $10,000. And that attorney added, "There are 2 juvenile victims in these cases, and each defendant is accused of causing or permitting serious physical injury to the victims in 3 different ways. 1, a combination of multiple physical injuries or torture. 2, starvation or malnutrition that jeopardizes life. And 3, causing severe emotional harm." And as far as where things stand with Ruby's husband, Kevin Franke, right, that was one of the big questions when we first covered this, his attorney told Good Morning America that he's been separated from Ruby and they haven't lived together for 13 months, and he is distraught at these allegations. But for now, that's where we are, and we'll keep our eyes on this story, so when there are updates, you'll know. And then, a deadly game of hide and seek has eastern Pennsylvania petrified, and it all begins with a story of so-called romance and murder. Or because you have Deborah, a 33-year-old Brazilian woman who came to the United States years ago looking to secure a better future for her 2 young children. And at her home in Chester County, she met a friendly neighbor, 34-year-old Danilo Cavalcante. He, like her, was also Brazilian, and soon enough, they started dating. But Deborah's sister said that while he was nice at first, things eventually changed. With her saying about Deborah, she kept saying that he was extremely jealous, that when he drank, he became a different person, that he kept going through her cell phone. So in late 2020, Deborah files a protection from abuse order against him, alleging he had a history of assaulting her and once pulled a knife on her. But then, just months later, he showed up at her home and killed her. And as it turns out, he's also wanted for another homicide that happened in Brazil in 2017. And before he could escape the authorities, they arrested him, and he was convicted last month for first-degree murder. And the judge there is sentencing him to life without parole, but apparently he was having none of that, because 8 days ago, he escaped, with video showing him in the prison's exercise yard, crab walking up the side of this building by putting his hands on one wall, placing his feet on another, and then shimmying up out of frame, with him then reportedly getting through some razor wire at the top, running across the roof, scaling another fence, and then going through more razor wire. And reportedly, there are now several people taking blame for this. First, whoever was monitoring the prison's 160 cameras. Second, the guard who is in the tower overlooking the exercise yard and who is now on administrative leave. And third, the consultants who were brought in to reinforce security after another inmate escaped using the same route back in May, where it turns out that razor wire was added to stop future escapees from scaling the wall, but clearly it wasn't enough. And so for the past week, hundreds of officers have been searching for this man, and they've gotten several credible sightings within a few miles of the prison. Right on Monday, a trail camera caught him at Longwood Gardens, scaring 2 nearby school districts into canceling classes, with him somehow appearing to have obtained a backpack, a duffel sling type pack, and a hooded sweatshirt. Then on Tuesday, a resident spotted him in a creek bed in Pennsbury Township, but he fled into the woods before the police could get him. And with that, a big reason that he's eluded them is that the environment is great for hiding. Right, you've got miles of dense woodlands, ravines, and tall grass, as well as residential property with many outbuildings and landscaping. And then you're dealing with 90-degree heat and humidity that not only put one search dog out of service, but also blinds aerial infrared cameras. Plus, keep in mind, we're talking about a guy who's 5 foot tall, 120 pounds, so he's not exactly a large target. But, of course, despite his size, police say that he is extremely dangerous and desperate not to get caught. And so they've warned local residents to keep their doors locked, stay inside, check on each other, and check their security cameras. And arguably, no one's more terrified of this murderer on the loose than his ex-girlfriend Deborah's sister, or with her also having been taking care of the 2 motherless kids ever since the murder. And her saying, "I haven't slept for many days. Since then, I've been waking up with fright at night." And so now there's a $20,000 reward being offered to anyone who can help provide information leading to this man's capture. And so for any reason, that's you, go collect your money. And then a Florida man, so you know this story's gonna be good, was crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a hamster wheel, and he's now been arrested after a 3-day standoff. Or this guy who set off from Florida, apparently he intended to get to London by running on the wheel, but then 70 miles into his journey, the Coast Guard stopped him. Which may lead you to ask, where in the law does it say that it's illegal to hamster wheel across the ocean? And well, it turns out it doesn't actually look like it's illegal, but the issue is that our would-be hero went rogue when the Coast Guard approached his wheel, because he responded by threatening to harm himself with a knife and then pretended to have a bomb, with him finally getting arrested after a 3-day standoff, and he's been charged with obstructing a boarding and violation of a captain of the port order. And as it turns out, looking into this is his 4th time attempting to do this. And actually in 2002, he was arrested for trying to illegally enter the United States. But the judge there let him off and granted him asylum after he promised to run from LA to New York City to commemorate the 2nd anniversary of 9/11. He was set free on a $250,000 bond with the terms that he can't go into the ocean or board a vessel on the ocean. So, you know, normal Florida man things. And then, y'all, it is my favorite time of year starting today. Football season. I'm gonna be glued to my couch watching the games. I'm actually gonna go to a game this weekend. And with that, I need to tell you about a fantastic sponsor of today's show, Underdog Fantasy. And Underdog is the easiest way to play fantasy sports, and not just football. You can make picks on baseball, basketball, UFC, and more. And it's simple. You just pick whether you think your favorite player's stats will be higher or lower, and you can make big money, not just get bragging rights. Like this, these are my picks for NFL Week 1. As you can tell, I'm very impatient. I wanna know how it's gonna go by the end of Thursday. And if I'm right on all of them, I'm walking out with 20 times my money. You can also make your own entry with as few as 2 picks and still make 3 times your money back. And Underdog's pick'em games are available in 32 states, including California, Texas, and Florida. So what are you waiting for? And I know for me personally, it's gonna make watching the Chargers game this weekend even more interesting, especially because in my main fantasy league, my buddies sniped Eckler and Herbert from me. Yeah, you can rep your team and make your own picks with Underdog. All you gotta do is sign up by clicking the link down below or via the App Store with promo code DeFranco, or the link down in the description, or scan the QR code, and Underdog will double your first deposit of $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code DeFranco. And then Rotten Tomatoes is a fraud. That is what many are saying now after an investigation published in Vulture highlighting just how easily the platform, which is the most influential site in film criticism, is gamed. With one of the biggest takeaways being that some critics have allegedly been paid to write reviews to boost a film's Rotten Tomatoes score. In the piece, using a 2018 film, Ophelia, starring Daisy Ridley, to highlight how this works. Noting that when a publicity company called Bunker 15 started working on the film, there were only 13 critics' reviews from early screenings, and 7 of those were negative, landing the movie at 46% on the platform. With that, of course, translating to not good, because anything below 60% is considered rotten. And so Bunker 15 allegedly took matters into their own hands to up that number, by reportedly recruiting obscure, often self-published critics who are nevertheless part of the pool tracked by Rotten Tomatoes. And noting in another break from standard practice, several critics say Bunker 15 pays them $50 or more for each review. And further explaining that a Bunker 15 staffer emailed a potential reviewer about the film and noting that the movie would benefit from more input from different critics. And that employee did say, of course, journalists can write whatever they feel, but they also added that, quote, super nice ones often agree to not publish negative reviews on their primary website, instead sidelining those to a smaller blog that Rotten Tomatoes never sees, so they can make sure that the platform's only getting the positive reviews and the negative ones don't influence the score. And then bam, would you look at that, over the span of a few months, 8 new reviews were added for Ophelia, with notably 7 of them being positive, and most of which came from critics who had reviewed other Bunker 15 movies. And so Ophelia's score climbed to a much better 62%, with one writer saying that Bunker 15 even tried to lobby them to change their negative review to something that would just be, quote, barely overall positive. Now, with all that said, for what it's worth, the founder of Bunker 15 denied that they pay for reviews to manipulate Rotten Tomatoes, instead telling Vulture, "Wow, you are really reaching there. We have thousands of writers in our distribution list. A small handful have set up a specific system where filmmakers can sponsor or pay to have them review a film. But it's also not just bribery that's allegedly being used to game Rotten Tomatoes, right? Because reportedly its algorithm is flawed to begin with it calculating scores by deciding if a review is good or bad, and then dividing the positives by the total, meaning that all reviews are weighted the same, whether it comes from a noted publication or a random Substack. And notably in this situation, there's also no room for nuance, right? For reviews in the middle, or let's say a film is excellent versus kinda good, or horrific versus not my cup of tea. And on top of that, Rotten Tomatoes starts publishing scores when as few as like 5 reviews are in. And even though those reviews might not reflect how the final pool of critics at large see the film, if they're positive, studios will run with it and put that high score on every piece of marketing. When you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's not surprising that studios have made a game out of this, where they try to make sure that the first critics to see the movie are going to be the ones that like it. That way it has as high a score as possible when early ticket sales start before any more negative reviews might roll in. And while that's certainly not as blatantly unethical as paying for positive reviews, it is a sign of why these scores can't always be trusted. And it also hits on why so many in the film industry just can't stand the chokehold Rotten Tomatoes has in this space. In fact, it's why we saw so many critics responding to this piece by saying things like, Rotten Tomatoes has always been an embarrassment to the profession. The certified critic designation, the equivalent of a participation trophy, the grading format, a total sham. And even absent any foul play from studios and PR firms, the platform is useless as a metric for evaluation, deeply anti-art and antithetical to good criticism. As well as, why am I wasting my time trying and often failing to say something interesting about movies I see when I should just be writing yes or no and hitting publish? Now with all this, it is also worth noting that when Vulture contacted Rotten Tomatoes about Bunker 15's alleged antics, the company said, "We take the integrity of our scores seriously."